So a pipeline just to simply copy data from one place to the other is quite a useful thing. It's something that you might use quite frequently. But more commonly, you'll want to do some sort of transformation or some kind of computational task to process the data while you're transferring it. So we're going to look at ways of transforming data and creating pipelines that include those kind of transformative activities. So here I am in my portal, and just to explain what's going to go on here, I have a number of different Azure services available to me. I've got my storage account, which we've seen previously. I've got my Azure SQL database, which we've used, and of course I've got my Azure Data Factory, which I've been using to run pipelines. Now I've also got an Azure Data Lake Analytics service and an associated Azure Data Lake store. So if I have a look at my Azure Data Lake Analytics service here, we can see that it's called ADL12345. It has an associated data store called ADLS12345, and it's also linked to my storage account. I've gone into the data sources for that Azure Data Lake Analytics, and I've added a data source. So my U-SQL jobs that are going to run in Azure Data Analytics can run against data that's in my Azure Data Lake store, but also against data that's in my regular Azure storage account. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a pipeline that runs a U-SQL job to process some data. And that data is going to be based on some web server logs. So let's just take a look at what that looks like. I've got some files over here. If I take a look in my Cloud Explorer and have a look in my storage account. So here's my GStore storage account. And we'll take a look at the ADF data container. I've got some IIS logs in here. Actually, you'll see it's in 2016 01 for January, and then there's a file called log.txt, and I've got the same for 02 and so on. So I've got all these different folders in that hierarchy structure, and if I take a look at the data that's in that, we'll just download that file. It's quite a large file, so it takes a little while to download. And then when it opens up, you can see it's just a regular web server log file that contains some data from in this case, from an IIS server. So we've got those log files, and what we're going to do with those log files is we're going to summarize them before we load them into our database. So if I take a look at the database that I've got here, here's my data DB. I've got a table called U-SQL logs, and we'll just run a query against that. So we'll just go and create a new query. And we will select star from dbo.usql logs. And you can see that it consists of a log date, the number of requests on that date, the number of bytes that were input on that date, and the number of bytes that were output on that date. So we've summarized the data in those log files from each individual request. We're grouping them by date and summarizing the number of requests and the bytes in and out. So to do that, I'm going to have to run some computational logic against the data. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take my source log files and I'm going to run a U-SQL script against them. So here's the U-SQL script. I'm going to extract all the individual fields from the log file to get that data. So that's things like the date, the time, the client IP address, the username, and so on, all the stuff that's in the source log data. And I'm then going to create a summary of that by selecting the date, counting the number of hits, and or number of records is the number of hits, and summarizing the server bytes and the client bytes. We'll just use the sum function to get totals for those, group that by date, and then output that as a summary file. And that summary file is going to be stored in my my output location in Azure Data Lake storage. So what we're doing then is getting that data, outloading it. You can see that the log file, the variable for log here is loading it in from log file, this variable here. So I haven't specified a hard-coded path. I'm going to pass that in as a parameter. And similarly, I'm going to output it to a path. And again, I'm going to pass in that path name as a parameter. So that's how I'm going to summarize the data. How does this all work as an Azure Data Lake, or rather an Azure Data Factory pipeline? Well, let's take a look at that. You can see I've got some linked services already set up here. So I've got a linked service for my Azure Data Lake Analytics. And if I open that up, you can see I've got, it's called ADL Analytics. It's of type Azure Data Lake Analytics. That's the account name of my ADL account. And I've already set up the authorization. There's a one-time business of getting an authorization token that happens here. This is actually easier to do. It's one of the few occasions where it's easier to do it in the web browser than it is in Visual Studio. So I've already gone ahead and set all of that up. When you do it in the lab, you'll do it in the browser, and there's a nice easy button to click to do that. So we've got that all set up ready to be authorized. I've done the same thing with my Azure Data Lake Store. That's another linked service I'm going to use. And in this case, it's the Azure Data Lake Store. There's the path to my store. It's adls12345.azuredatalakestore.net, and all the way through to the web HDFS endpoint. And again, I've set up the authorization for that. So those are the two linked services for my Azure Data Lake. I've also got the blob store, which we've seen before, where I'm connecting to my blob storage to get the source data, and my SQL database, which I'm using to get data. I'm using to load the data into the table. And I've then got my various data sets. Now there's the original source data set is the IIS log text file. So that looks like this. It's a text file that has the log date, the log time, the client IP, the client username, and so on. So I've got all those fields, and that's going to be loaded from that location based on the year and the month folders. I'm going to load that text file. It's going to be called log.txt. So basically any file that's in that folder. We're going to load that in, and we're going to have that as a text format that's space delimited, partitioned by the year and month. So that's going to appear every month. We're going to get a new file, and we're going to load that data. So that's the original source data that we need to load. And once we load that data, we're going to run our U-SQL script on it and generate a summarized output. And that summarized output will look like this. It's going to have the log date, the number of requests, the bytes in and the bytes out. And that is going to be stored in this particular folder path here, IIS logs, summary, year, month. That's where we're going to put summary.txt. And that's going to be available for us to then pick up. And when we pick that up, we're then going to load that into our U-SQL logs table in our SQL database. So here's the schema for that, the data set that defines that table we're going to load the data into. So we've got these various data sets all set up. And finally, we have our pipeline, which looks like this. And you can actually see in the diagram for the pipeline, if I just go and zoom into that there, you can see that that consists of our initial text file. We then use a U-SQL script, which will run in Azure Data Lake Analytics to summarize the data. That outputs our summary file. That summary file then gets copied across to our SQL Server, or Azure SQL Database in this case, and gets loaded into our U-SQL logs table. So we're going to go ahead and have these two activities that occur in this pipeline. Now, if we take a look at the JSON for that pipeline, it's called summarize logs U-SQL. And we're going to specify, first of all, an activity of type Data Lake Analytics U-SQL, where it's going to grab the U-SQL script file that we looked at earlier on to do the summary. It's going to have to connect to our blob store to go ahead and get the data from there. And then it's going to go ahead and connect to our storage account. Now, I need to put the name of the storage account here, so we'll just go and put that in. It's gstore12345. It needs to go ahead and connect to that in order to get the data. And then we're going to go in and summarize that data and output that into this location. So we're passing in these parameters to our query. We're going to pass in the summary file location where we write it out to, and that's fine. The log file was the parameter for the data that's being read. So off it goes and loads that and gets that data summarized, runs the script to summarize it. And then we have another activity of type copy, where we're going to take our Azure Data Lake store as the source. So we're going to go and grab the data the summarized data that's been generated, and we're going to go ahead and summarize that data and load it into our U-SQL logs table in our database. And again, we've scheduled that to run every month. So that's our pipeline. Let's go ahead and deploy that. We'll just publish. We'll publish it to our existing Azure Data Factory. Go through the wizard. And when all the components have been uploaded and registered and we've actually started the pipeline, we can just finish out of that. And if I go and now have a look at my Azure Data Factory, I should be able to go into Monitor and Manage. And we'll just change our filter window. You can see the Summarize Logs U-SQL pipeline is there. It's currently active. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to filter the window for the activity windows so I can see the activities as they happen. So starting on the 1st of January 2016 at 0000 hours and ending at the end of July. So we'll just get that to the end of July. We'll apply that. And we'll filter the pipeline as well so that we are only looking at the Summarize Logs U-SQL pipeline. And I can see that we're waiting for various things, but I've got some that are currently in progress here. I can see there's a job in process there for January and February. So it's running the January and February files just now. And actually, if I go back to my Azure portal here and go and look at my various different services, I should be able to go to my Azure Data Lake and take a look at the jobs that are running there. And I can see that there are 2 active jobs running there where it's running some U-SQL scripts. So I can see that this pipeline is now running. It's going and running my U-SQL script to summarize the data that it got from Azure Storage. It's then writing those summarized results in Azure Data Lake Store. It's then getting picked up by the pipeline from there, and it's being copied across to my Azure SQL database. So I could continue to monitor the activity here. It'll take a good little while to run, but I can see that actually January and February have already completed. And if I now go back to my Visual Studio environment and go and take a look at that database, so we'll just go into SQL Explorer, we'll create a new query here, and we will select star from dbo.usql logs. It's actually auto-completed it for me. Go ahead and run that. And I can see that some of that data has in fact been copied across into the table. So we've got our pipeline that we've created that has 2 activities in it. It has our activity for using U-SQL to summarize the data, first of all, using Data Lake Analytics. And then after we've summarized the data, we pick up the output from that and we copy that across to our SQL database. So that's a fairly common pattern for building pipelines where we take the data from some source, perhaps from multiple sources, we apply some computational logic to do something to transform that data, and then eventually we write that data to some destination source.